The Story of Civilization, Volume 5, The Renaissance, Part 2, by Will Durant. Continued, Cassette 10, Side 2. He was a rich man now, though the memory of early insecurity made him acquisitive to the end. Venice exempted him from certain taxes out of regard for his rare excellence. He wore elegant clothing and lived in a comfortable home with a spacious garden that overlooked the lagoon. We picture him there entertaining poets, artists, blue bloods, cardinals, and kings. The mistress whom he had married in 1525, after having 2 sons by her, died in 1530, and he resumed the baccalaureate liberty that he had enjoyed for almost half a century before. His daughter Lavinia was a joy and pride, and he made fond portraits of her, even in her matronly amplitude. But she too died a few years after his marriage. One son, Pomponio, became a worthless wastrel, saddening the old man's heart. The other, Orazio, painted some lost pictures, and probably shared in the works ascribed to his father's final years. Perhaps another of Titian's pupils, Domenico Theotocopoulos, El Greco, helped him then, though there is no sign of it in Titian's buxom figures and joyous scenes. Far into old age he painted almost every day, and found in his art his only secure happiness. There he knew that he was master, that all the world acclaimed him, and that his hand had not lost its cunning, nor his eye its keenness. Even his intellect, as well as his imagination, seemed to keep its power to the end. Some purchasers complained that these final paintings were sent to them unfinished. Even so, they were miracles. Probably no other painter, excepting Raphael, ever possessed such technical facility, such control of color and texture, such wizardry of variegated light. His faults were those of rapid execution, sometimes careless drawing. Most of his preliminary designs were tentative. Yet when he cared to take the time, he could produce such a marvel as the pen drawing of Medoro and Angelica in the Musée Bonnat at Bayonne. In portraiture he had to work rapidly, for his subjects were too impatient and occupied to give him long or frequent sittings. Therefore he made a quick sketch and painted from that, perhaps putting more into the subject's face and head than was really there. In paintings other than portraits he gave too much prominence to physical features and seldom caught the spiritual essence. In depth of insight and feeling he could not match Leonardo or Michelangelo. But how healthy his art is compared with theirs. No abnormal introverted broodings, no volcanic grumblings at the nature of the world and man. Titian took the world as he found it, took men as he found them, took women when he found them, and enjoyed them all. He was a frank pagan who contemplated the architecture of woman with delight through 90 years. Even his virgins are healthy, happy, and nubile. The poverty, grief, and insecurity of life found little room in Titian's art. Except for a few martyrdoms and crucifixions, all is beauty and joy. He grew old while painting and lived a quarter-century after the normal span of life. In his 88th year he traveled to Brescia and accepted an arduous commission to paint a ceiling in the palace of the Commune. Vasari, visiting him in his 90th year, found him at work, brush in hand. At 91 he painted a portrait of Jacopo da Strada, now in Vienna, brilliant with color, strong with character. But now at last his hand began to tremble, his eyes grew weak, and he felt that the time had come for piety. In 1576, aged 99, he agreed to paint a burial of Christ for the Church of the Frari in exchange for a burial place there, where already 2 of his greatest works were hung. He did not finish it, and he fell a year short of living out a century. In that year, plague broke out in Venice. On each day, 200 died. A fourth of the population succumbed to the pestilence. Titian himself died during the plague, probably not of it, but from old age, on August 26, 1576. The government set aside its prohibition of public gatherings in order to give him a state funeral. He was buried in Santa Maria Gloriosa de Frari, as he had wished. It was the end of a magnificent life and a wondrous age. 4. Tintoretto, 1518 to 1594. It was not quite the end, for a power and spirit almost as great had still 18 years to live, and had still to paint his paradise. Jacopo Robusti was the son of a dyer, hence the diminutive nickname by which the whimsical Italians have sent him down to history. He became indeed a tintor, as a great colorist, but his family name fitted him well enough, for only a robust soul could have survived the long struggle that Jacopo had to fight for recognition. Almost the first notice we have of him is that he was apprenticed to Titian at an unknown age and was dismissed after a few days. Carlo Ridolfi, writing a century later, recounts the incident from the point of view of Tintoretto's descendants. When Titian came home and entered the place where his students were, he saw some papers sticking out from a desk, and seeing certain figures drawn on them, he asked who had done them. Jacopo said timidly that they were by his hand. Thereupon Titian, foreseeing from such beginnings that the lad would become a very able man and would bring him some trouble in art, impatiently, as soon as he had gone upstairs and laid aside his mantle, bade Girolamo Dante, his chief pupil, to immediately forbid Jacopo the house. So a little tinge of jealousy works in human hearts. We should like to reject this story, but Aretino, Titian's bosom friend, alludes to the incident in a letter of 1549. The dismissal is a fact. The interpretation is problematic. It is hard to believe that Titian, who was already a painter to kings when Jacopo was only a lad of 12, could be jealous of so hypothetical a competitor, or that he could see the future Tintoretto in the drawings of a student just admitted to his school. It is possible that the drawings offended Titian by their carelessness rather than by their excellence. Careless drawing remained a fault in Tintoretto through many years. Jacopo throughout his life expressed great admiration for Titian, treasured a picture that Titian had given him, and put upon the wall of his studio a constant reminder of what he aspired to achieve in painting: the design of Michelangelo and the color of Titian. According to Ridolfi and tradition, Jacopo had no instruction after leaving Titian, but taught himself by assiduous copying and experiment. He dissected bodies to learn anatomy. He observed almost every object in his experience with predatory eagerness, resolved to capture it in full detail in one or another of his paintings. He made models in wax, wood, or cardboard, dressed them and drew them from every angle to find ways of portraying 3 dimensions in 2. He had casts made and sent to him of ancient marbles in Florence and Rome, and of Michelangelo's statuary. He set up these casts in his studio and painted images of them in divers shadows and lights. He was fascinated by the variations produced in the appearance of objects by changes in the quantity, character, and incidence of light. He made 100 pictures by lamp or candle illumination. He grew too fond of dim backgrounds and heavy shadows. He became a specialist in picturing the play of light and shade upon hands and face and drapes, buildings and landscapes and clouds. He left no pebble unturned in his struggle for excellence. Nevertheless, there was an impatient haste and lack of finish in his work, possibly a penalty of self-instruction, which deferred the public recognition of his art. For years after reaching manhood, he had to solicit opportunities. He painted furniture, frescoed house fronts, begged builders to get him decorative jobs at low fees, and tried to sell his pictures by displaying them in St. Mark's Square. Everybody wanted Titian, and Titian and Aretino saw to it that nobody of extractable substance should get anyone but Titian, or if Titian was busy, Bonifacio Veronese. Jacopo must have resented Aretino's pictorial pandering, but later, when the great scourge came to him for a portrait, the artist pulled an impressive pistol from his pocket, pretended to measure with it Aretino's majestic dimensions, and enjoyed the mighty blackmailer's fright. Thereafter, Pietro's pen was polite to Tintoretto. When Jacopo noted the vast unpainted walls, 50 feet high, of the choir in the church of the Madonna dell'Orto, he offered to cover their nakedness with frescoes for a total fee of 100 ducats, or about $1,250, whereupon the Venetian painters complained that he was injuring the trade by underselling art. But Tintoretto was resolved to paint. He was 30 before his first triumph came. The Scuola di San Marco opened a competition for a painting of St. Mark delivering a slave. The story was in Jacopo de Voragine's Golden Legend. A Provençal servant had promised St. Mark to make a pilgrimage to his grave in Alexandria. His master refused him permission to go, but he went nevertheless. When he returned, the master ordered his eyes to be gouged out, but the iron points pressed upon them failed to penetrate their surface. The master ordered the slave's limbs to be broken, but the iron rods failed to make any impression upon them. The master, recognizing the intervention of St. Mark, pardoned the slave. Tintoretto's picture told the tale with magnificent color, convincing realism, and dramatic intensity. The evangelist, clinging to his gospel, descends from heaven to rescue his devotee, who is about to be beheaded by a Moor, while a score of diverse figures look excitedly on. Jacopo seized every opportunity the story gave him, to limn powerful male and graceful female figures, to study the action of light upon oriental velvets, silks, and turbans, to bathe the scene in colors learned from Giorgione and Titian. The directors of the Scuola were a bit frightened by the fleshly realism of the painting. They debated whether to place it on their walls. The impetuous Tintoretto proudly snatched it from their hands and took it home. They came and begged him to return it. He let them wait a chastening while, then yielded it. Aretino sent him a word of praise, and career was now open to his talent. Soon commissions came in multitude. A dozen churches solicited him, a dozen lords, half a dozen princes and states. For these he told again in 100 paintings the mighty epic of the Christian cosmology, theology, and eschatology, from the creation to the last judgment. He was not a religious man. Few artists were in this 16th century Venice, half-molded in soul and dominions by the heretical or Islamic East. Art was his religion, to which he sacrificed night and day. But what finer subjects could a painter fancy than the legends of Adam and Eve, and the story of Mary and her babe, and the tragedy of the God-man crucified, and the sufferings and marvels of the saints, and the awful climax of all history in the summoning of the quick and the dead to the judgment seat of Christ? The best of this long series is the Presentation, circa 1556, which Tintoretto painted for the church of Madonna dell'Orto. The Temple of Jerusalem, pictured in classic splendor, a timid little Mary welcomed by the high priest with outstretched arms and beard, a woman drawn with the majesty of Phidias, pointing Mary out to her daughter, other women and their children vividly realized, a prophet preaching enigmatic prophecies, beggars and cripples half naked, crouching on the temple steps. This is a picture rivaling the best of Titian, one of the grand paintings of the Renaissance. Tintoretto's success was confirmed when in 1564 the Scuola di San Rocco, or the Confraternity of St. Roch, named him to decorate their albergo, or assembly rooms. To choose a painter for the vast wall surfaces, the directors invited artists to submit drawings for a picture to fit into a ceiling oval, showing St. Roch in glory. While Paolo Veronese, Andrea Schiavone, and others made sketches, Tintoretto painted a finished picture, flaming with color and alive with action, had the canvas secretly pasted in the assigned place and covered, and on the day when the others presented their drawings, had this painting uncovered, to the consternation of judges and competitors. He excused this unorthodox strategy on the ground that he could work best in this impulsive way instead of following a cartoon. The other artists cried foul. Tintoretto withdrew from the contest, but left the painting as a gift to the fraternity. The Scuola finally accepted it, made Tintoretto a member, gave him a salary of 100 ducats a year for life, and required of him in return to paint for them 3 pictures per year. In the next 18 years, from 1564 to 1581, he placed 56 scenes upon the albergo walls. The rooms were poorly lighted. Tintoretto had to work in semi-darkness. He worked rapidly, laying on his colors coarsely, as to be seen from 20 feet below. These paintings became the most famous one-man exhibition in Venetian history, and later artists came to study them almost as students in Florence went to study Masaccio. Rain and damp attacked the pictures through the years, but they are still impressive in their scope and power. 20 or 30 years ago, wrote Ruskin 100 years ago, they were taken down to be restored, but the man to whom the task was committed providentially died, and only one of them was spoiled. In this astonishing museum, Tintoretto told the Christian story once more, but as it had never been painted before, with an audacious realism that took the episodes out of the world of ideal sentiment and placed them in such natural surroundings that legend seemed transformed into the most indubitable history. The capacity to see, to note every detail of a scene, to feel these details as giving life, to dash them onto the wall with a stroke or two of the brush, like the water visible through the laurel roots in the Magdalene, these were sparks of Tintoretto's fire. He devoted the lower floor of the albergo to Mary, her humble surprise in the Annunciation, her modest grace in the Visitation, her simple awe at the precious Oriental gifts in the Adoration of the Magi, her slow procession on donkey-back across a peaceful landscape in the flight into Egypt, safe from that massacre of the innocents, which provides the most powerful picture in this group. On the walls of the main upper room, Tintoretto recounted events in the life of Christ, the baptism by John, the temptation by Satan, the miracles, the Last Supper. This last was so unconventionally realistic that Ruskin called it the worst I know of Tintoretto. Christ at the farther end, the apostles absorbed in eating or conversing, servants bustling about with food, a dog inquiring when he too may eat. In an inner room of the upper story, Tintoretto painted 2 of his greatest paintings. Christ before Pilate shows an unforgettable figure clad in a white robe as if in a shroud, standing quietly in weariness and resignation, and yet in dignity, before a Pilate trying to wash away the guilt of yielding to the bloodlust of a mob. And last of all, judged by Tintoretto to be his best work, the Crucifixion, challenging and surpassing Michelangelo's Last Judgment in power and range of composition, in artistry of execution, 40 feet of wall and 80 figures with horses, mountains, towers, trees, all with incredible fidelity to detail. Christ in visualized agony of body and soul, one robber being forced down upon a prostrate cross and resisting to the last, another, a titan of strength and desperation, being raised to his death by rough soldiers too angry at his weight to have a mind for pity. Women huddled in terrified groups, spectators crowding eager to watch men suffer and die, and in the distance a lowering sky offering no answer to the human tragedy but thunder and lightning and an indifferent rain. Here Tintoretto has reached his zenith and equaled the best. To all these masterpieces in the Albergo, Tintoretto added 8 pictures for the church of the same fraternity, chiefly concerning St. Roch himself. One of these paintings stands out, if only through its terribilità, the Pool of Bethesda. The artist takes his text from the 5th chapter of the 4th Gospel. A crowd of invalids used to lie there, the blind, the lame, and folk with shriveled limbs, waiting for a chance to bathe in the healing pool. Tintoretto sees not the miraculous healing of the cripple, but the variously diseased or stricken multitude, and he draws them unflinchingly as he sees them, in their malformations, their rags and filth, their hope and despair. It is a scene as from Dante's Inferno or Zola's Lourdes. The same man who could so rage, with his art, against the ills that flesh is heir to, responded eagerly to the splendors of the flesh in the beauty of its health, and almost rivaled Titian and Correggio in portraying nudes. Though we might have expected his turbulent spirit and swift brush to fail in conveying the ancient sense of beauty and repose, we find scattered over Europe such delectable figures as the Danae of the Lyon Museum, dressed in jewelry, the Leda and Swan of the Uffizi, the Venus and Vulcan of the Munich Pinakothek, the Dresden Deliverance of Arsinoe, the Mercury and Graces, and Bacchus and Ariadne of the Doge's Palace. Symonds thought this last, if not the greatest, at any rate the most beautiful oil painting in existence. And yet more perfect is the London Gallery's Origin of the Milky Way, from Cupid's pressure upon Juno's breasts, as good an explanation as any. The Louvre, the Prado, Vienna, and the Washington Gallery have Susanna and the Elders in 4 Tintoretto versions. The Prado has a roomful of sensuous Tintorettos, a young Venetian woman drawing her robe aside to reveal her bosom. Even in the Battle of the Turks and Christians, 2 distracting breasts appear amid the gleam of arms. And in the Verona Museum is a concert of 9 women musicians, 3 of them bare to the waist, as if ears could hear when eyes had so much to see. These pictures are not the best of Tintoretto. His forte was in the massive representation of virile life and heroic death. But they show that he, too, like Giorgione and Titian, could turn a perilous curve with a steady hand. And in all his nudes there is no immodesty. There is a healthy sensualism. These gods and goddesses take nudity as natural, and are not conscious of it. It is divine of them to greet the sun, all face, whole bodily, and not be harassed and jailed with buttons and laces and bows. After avoiding marriage for nearly 40 years, Tintoretto took to wife Faustina de Vescovi, who found him so disorderly and helpless that she achieved happiness in mothering him. She gave him 8 children, 3 of whom became pardonable painters. They lived in a modest house not far from the church of Madonna dell'Orto, and the artist seldom wandered from that vicinity except to paint in a Venetian church, palace, or fraternity. Consequently, he can be appreciated in his variety and power only in the city of his birth. The Duke of Mantua offered him a place at his court. He refused. He was happy only in his studio, where he worked literally night and day. He was a good husband and father, but cared nothing for the social pleasures. He was almost as solitary, independent, moody, melancholy, nervous, vehement, and proud as the Michelangelo whom he ever worshipped and ever strove to surpass. There was no peace in his soul or his works. Like Angelo, he honored strength of body and mind and spirit above surface beauty. His virgins are often as unprepossessing as the Doni Madonna. He has left us his own portrait, now in the Louvre, painted when he was 72. It could have been the head and face of Angelo himself. A strong and somber face, profound and wondering, and bearing the marks of 100 storms. His own was his best portrait, but he painted some others that attest the depth of his insight and the integrity of his art. For there, too, he remained a realist, and no man dared sit for him who hoped to deceive posterity. Many a Venetian worthy has come down to us through Tintoretto's brush: doges, senators, procurators, 3 provveditori of the mint, 6 treasurers. Above all, in this group, Jacopo Soranzo, one of the great portraits in Venetian art. Here, too, are Sansovino, the architect, and Cornaro, the centenarian. Surpassed in Tintoretto's gallery of portraits only by the Soranzo are anonymous pictures of the man in a cuirass, now in the Prado, the portrait of an old man at Brescia, the portrait of a man at the Hermitage in Leningrad, and Amour in the Morgan Library in New York. In 1574, Tintoretto disguised himself as an attendant of Doge Alvise Mocenigo, secured entry to the Venetian flagship Bucentaur, and clandestinely made a pastel sketch of Henry III of France. Later, in the corner of a chamber where Henry gave audience to notables, Tintoretto perfected the portrait. Henry liked it so much that he offered a knighthood to the artist, who begged to be excused. His acquaintance with the Venetian aristocracy had begun about 1556, when, with Veronese, he received a commission to paint canvases in the ducal palace. In the Sala del Maggior Consiglio, he pictured the coronation of Frederick Barbarossa, and Barbarossa excommunicated by Alexander III. In the Sala del Scrutinio, he covered an entire wall with the Last Judgment. These so pleased the Senate that it chose him in 1572 to commemorate the great victory at Lepanto. All 4 of these paintings were destroyed in the fire of 1577. In 1574, the Senate engaged Tintoretto to decorate the Anticollegio, or antechamber. Here the artist inspired the Solons with Mercury and the Graces, Ariadne and Bacchus, the Forge of Vulcan, and Mars pursued by Minerva. In the Sala dei Pregadi, or Senate Hall, Tintoretto painted from 1574 to 1585 a series of spacious panels celebrating the doges of his time, pictured against the background of the majestic square. St. Mark's and its sparkling cupolas, or the clock tower, or the campanile, or the stately facade of the Libreria Vecchia, or the radiant arcades of the Doge's palace, or the misty or sunny vistas of the Grand Canal. Then, crowning this sequence to the taste of the proud government, he painted on the ceiling a triumphal picture of Venice, Queen of the Seas, robed in splendor as a dogaressa, surrounded by circles of admiring divinities and receiving from Tritons and Nereids the gifts of the waters, corals, shells, and pearls. After the Great Fire, the undiscourageable Senate called upon Tintoretto to redeem the ruined walls with pictures that would drown all memory of the loss. In the Hall of Scrutiny he painted a tremendous battle scene, the capture of Zara. On a wall of the great council chamber he pictured the Emperor Frederick Barbarossa receiving envoys from the Pope and the Doge, and on the ceiling a masterpiece, the Doge Niccolo da Ponte receiving the homage of conquered cities. When in 1586 the Senate decided to cover the old fresco by Guariento on the east wall of the council chamber, they judged Tintoretto, then 68, to be too old for the task. They divided the assignment and the space between Paolo Veronese, then 58, and Francesco Bassano, 37. But Veronese died in 1588 before the work was actually begun. Tintoretto offered to take his place and proposed to cover the entire wall with one picture, the Glory of Paradise. The Senate agreed, and the old man, aided by his son Domenico and his daughter Marietta, laid out in the nearby Scuola della Misericordia the canvas sections that were to compose the picture. Many preliminary sketches were made. One, itself a chef-d'oeuvre, is in the Louvre. When all was set in place in 1590 and Domenico had painted and concealed the seams, it constituted the largest oil painting that had yet been seen, 72 feet long by 23 feet high. The crowds that flocked to see it agreed with Ruskin that it was the culminating achievement of Venetian painting, the most wonderful piece of pure, manly, and masterly oil painting in the world. The Senate offered Tintoretto so great a fee that he returned part of it, again to the scandal of his fellow artists. Time has had its way with this paradise, and today, when one enters the hall of the Great Council and turns back to the wall behind the Doge's throne, he does not find the picture that Tintoretto left there, but a painting so darkened by the smoke and damp of centuries that of the 500 figures that filled it, only a minority can now be made out distinctly by the eye. Circle within circle the figures vibrate, the simple blessed, the virgins, the confessors of the faith, the martyrs, the evangelists, the apostles, the angels, the archangels, all co-centered around Mary and her son, as if these two, in some fitting recognition of woman as well as man, had become the real deities of Latin Christendom. And beyond the 100 figures that can be seen, Tintoretto makes us feel countless hundreds more. After all, even if only a few are chosen of the many called, there must have come to paradise in 16 Christian centuries quite a happy host. And Tintoretto set himself to show their goodly number and their bliss. He did not deaden heaven with Dantesque solemnity. It was conceived as a place of joy, and only the radiantly happy were admitted there. It was the old artist's exorcism of his own misanthropy. He had reason to be sad, for in the very year of the great picture's unveiling, his beloved daughter Marietta had died. Her skill in painting and music had been among the chief delights of his old age. And now that she was gone, he seemed to think of nothing so much as of seeing her in another life. He went more frequently than before to Madonna dell'Orto, Our Lady of the Garden, and there spent hours in meditation and prayer, at last a humble man. He still painted and produced in these concluding years a series on St. Catherine for the church of her name. But in his 77th year a stomach ailment gave him such pain that he could no longer sleep. He made his will, bade goodbye to his wife and children and friends, and died on May 31st, 1594. Madonna dell'Orto received his remains. If, after boating through Venice to stand face to face in every corner of the city with this Michelangelo of the lagoons, we try to clear our conception of his art, the first impression is one of size and multitude, of enormous walls, pullulating with human and animal forms, in 1,000 degrees of beauty or ugliness, in a carnal confusion that has only this excuse, that it is life. This man who shunned and hated crowds saw them everywhere and reproduced them with fierce veracity. He seems to have taken little interest in individuals. If he painted portraits, it was frankly to earn a fee. He saw humanity in the gross, interpreted life and history in terms of masses of human beings, struggling, competing, loving, enjoying, suffering, virile and comely, diseased and crippled, saved or damned. He covered canvases of awesome immensity, because only such expanses gave him scope to picture what he saw. While never completely mastering, as Titian did, the technique of pictorial art, he worked out for himself the method of these gigantic paintings, and to him above all is due the grandeur of the rooms in the Palace of the Doges. Therefore we must not ask of him any finesse of finishing. He is crude, rough, hurried, and sometimes creates a scene with a splash of the brush. His real fault is not this coarseness of surface, for even a coarse surface may illuminate significance, but the theatrical violence of the episodes he chooses, the unhealthy turbulence of his moods, the gloom in which he bathes the life he shows, and the tiresome repetition of his crowds. He was infatuated with number, as Michelangelo with forms and Rubens with flesh. And yet even in these multitudes, what a wealth of meaningful detail, what accuracy and insight of observation, what inexhaustible individualization of the parts, what courageous realism, where before there had only been imagination and sentiment. Our final feeling in the presence of these pictures is one of affirmative response. This is art in the grand style. Other artists have painted beauty like Raphael, or strength like Michelangelo, or the depths of the soul like Rembrandt. But here in these cosmic canvases, as in the roar of a city, or in mute masses at prayer, or in the troubled and affectionate intimacies of 1,000 homes, is humanity. No other artist has ever seen it so large or pictured it so completely. Sometimes, silent before those fading walls in the Palace of the Doges or in the Confraternity of St. Roch, the canvases of better artists fall from our memory, and we feel that if he could have finished like a jeweler after so conceiving like a giant, the little Dyer would have been the greatest painter of them all. 5. Veronese, 1528 to 1588. Let us honor in passing some stars of the second magnitude. They, too, were part of the luminosity of Venice. Andrea Meldola was a Slavonian and received the name Schiavone. He studied with Titian and made a pretty Galatea on a chest in the Castello of Milan. In a Jupiter and Antiope in Leningrad and a presentation of the Virgin in Venice, he essayed a larger form and produced canvases of brilliant coloring. Artists praised him, patrons ignored him, and Andrea had to carry his bearded dignity in rags. Paris Bordone was the son of a saddler and the grandson of a shoemaker, but in the admirable democracy of genius, which appears in every rank, he made his way almost to the top in a Venice teeming with talent. Coming from Treviso to study under Titian, he matured so rapidly that at the age of 38 he was invited to Paris by Francis I. He turned out some excellent religious pictures, like the Baptism of Christ, in Washington, and the Holy Family in Milan, and reached his high point in The Fisherman presenting St. Mark's ring to the Doge in Venice. But the painting that has ferried him over the years is his Venus and Eros in the Uffizi. A stout blonde who uses a fine robe to reveal her breasts, while Cupid clamors for her attention. Jacopo da Ponte, called Il Bassano from his birthplace, reached a modest fame and fortune when Titian bought his Animals Going into the Ark. He painted some good portraits, for example The Bearded Man, in Chicago, and managed to live to the age of 82 without leaving behind him any pictured humans not clothed from head to foot. About 1553 there came from Verona to Venice a youth of 25, Paolo Cagliari, of a type contrasting sharply with Tintoretto, tranquil, friendly, sociable, self-critical, and only occasionally passionate. Like Tintoretto and nearly all educated Italians, he loved and practiced music. He was generous and honorable, never offended a rival, never disappointed a patron. Venice called him Il Veronese, and so the world knows him, though he adopted Venice as his home and one of his loves. He had many teachers in Verona, including his uncle Antonio Badile, who later gave him a daughter to wife. He was influenced by Giovanni Carota and Brusasorci. But these factors in the development of his style soon faded in the warm brilliance of Venetian art and life. He never ceased to wonder at the changing skies, playing their colors upon the Grand Canal. He marveled at the palaces and their tremulous reflections in the sea. He envied the aristocratic world of secure incomes and artistic friendships and gracious manners and garments of silk and velvet almost more tempting to the touch than the beautiful women they enclosed. He wished himself an aristocrat. He dressed like one in lace and furs, and imitated the high code of honor that he ascribed to the Venetian upper class. He hardly ever painted poor people, or poverty, or tragedy. His aim was to put this bright and fortunate world of the Venetian rich upon immortal canvas, and make it fairer and finer than wealth without art could ever be. The lords and ladies, the bishops and abbots, the doges and senators, took to him fondly, and soon he was working on a dozen commissions. As early as 1553, when he was only 25, he was asked to paint a ceiling for the Council of Ten in the Ducal Palace. There, likening the council to Jove, he pictured Jupiter overthrowing the vices, now in the Louvre. It was not especially successful. The heavy figures cavorted precariously in the air. Paolo had not quite caught the spirit of Venice. But 2 years later he found himself, and touched mastery, in painting the Triumph of Mordecai on the ceiling of San Sebastiano. The face and figure of the Jewish hero were forcefully rendered, and the horses breathed reality. Titian himself may have been impressed, for when the procurators of St. Mark's charged him to organize the decoration of the Libreria Vecchia with pictured medallions, he allotted 3 to Veronese, 1 each to other artists and himself. The procurators offered a golden chain for the best medallion. Paolo won it with a representation of music in the form of 3 young women, one playing a lute, another singing, a third intent upon her viola da gamba, and a Cupid at a harpsichord, and Pan puffing at his pipes. In some later pictures, Veronese portrays himself wearing his golden chain. Having acquired high repute for decorative painting, Paolo now received a lucrative assignment. The rich and lordly Barbaro family built in 1560 a luxurious villa at Macer, near that same Asolo where Caterina Cornaro played queen and Bembo played with platonic love. The Barbari chose none but leading artists to make this the finest pleasure house of the Renaissance. Andrea Palladio to design it, Alessandro Vittoria to ornament it with sculptured stucco, Veronese to fresco the ceilings and walls, spandrels and lunettes with scenes from pagan and Christian mythology. On the vault of the central dome he pictured Olympus, the gods who knew all the joys of life but never grew old and never died. Amid ethereal scenes, the impish artist introduced a hunter, a monkey, and a dog so perfect in its form and alert vitality as to be fit to be a hound of heaven. On one wall, a painted page looked across a distance at a painted maid, and she at him, and for an immortal moment they too fed on ambrosia. It was such a pleasure palace as only the more refined taste of Kublai Khan's Chinese could have surpassed. Inevitably, in this archipelago of Eros, Paolo received commissions to paint nudes. They were not his forte. He preferred rich, soft raiment covering semi-Rubensian forms, topped with comely, characterless faces, crowned with upswept coiffures of golden hair. The Mars and Venus now in the Metropolitan Museum of Art shows a fat and ungainly goddess with an unshapely dropsical leg. But she is lovely in the Venus and Adonis of the Prado, outshone only by the dog at her feet. Without a dog, Paolo could not paint. The finest of Veronese's mythologies is The Rape of Europa in the Palace of the Doges, a landscape of dark trees, winged putti dropping garlands, Europa, the Venetian princess, seating herself gaily upon the amorous bull, who licks one of her pretty feet, and turns out to be none other than Jupiter in a novel masquerade. The lucky Casanova of the skies here showed divine taste, for Europa, half-robed in queenly array, is Veronese's most successful synthesis of feminine perfection, worth leaving heaven for. The distant background continues the story by showing the bull carrying Europa across the sea to Crete, where, says a pretty legend, she gave her name to a continent. Paolo himself took his time before surrendering to woman. He gathered samples till he was 38. Then he married Elena Badile. She bore him 2 sons, Carlo and Gabriele. He trained both to be painters, and predicted, with more fondness than foresight, Carletto mi vincerà. Charlie will surpass me. Like Correggio, he bought a farm at Sant'Angelo di Treviso, and spent most of his married years there, managing his finances thriftily, and seldom straying from the Veneto. He was at 40 in 1568 the most sought-for painter in Italy, with invitations coming even from foreign lands. When Philip II asked him to decorate the Escorial, he appreciated the compliment, but resisted the lure. Like his predecessors, he was called upon to paint the sacred story for churches and worshippers. After 1,000 Madonnas, we find everything fresh and attractive in the Madonna of the Cucino family, now in Dresden. The handsome black-bearded donors, the disconcertingly natural children, and the white-shawled figure of Fate, a woman of such majestic beauty as even Venetian art seldom equaled. The marriage at Cana, now in the Louvre, was just the scene that Veronese liked to paint. Roman architecture for a background, a dog or two in the foreground, and 100 persons in 100 attitudes. He drew them all as if every one were to be a major portrait, and placed among them Titian, Tintoretto, Bassano, and himself, each playing a stringed instrument. Paolo, unlike Tintoretto, cared nothing for realism. Instead of making his feasters such men and women as a small Judean town might furnish, he made the host a Venetian millionaire, gave him a palace worthy of Augustus, and guests and dogs of pedigree, and provided the tables with delicate food and miraculous wine. If one should judge from Veronese, Christ had many a feast amid his tribulations. In the Louvre we see him dining in the house of Simon the Pharisee, with Magdalene washing his feet, and splendid female figures moving about among Corinthian columns. In Turin he sups in the house of Simon the leper, and in the Venice Academy he dines in the house of Levi. But then again in Veronese's gallery we see Christ fainting under the weight of the cross in Dresden, and crucified against a lowering sky, with the towers of Jerusalem dim in the distance below, in the Louvre. The end of the great drama is subdued, simple pilgrims supping with Christ at Emmaus, with charming children fondling the inevitable dog. Greater than these illustrations of the New Testament are Veronese's pictures from the lives and legends of the saints. St. Helena, robed in beauty, believing that she sees angels transporting the cross. St. Anthony, tortured by a muscular youth and an angelic female. St. Jerome in the wilderness, comforted by his books. St. George, ecstatically welcoming martyrdom. St. Anthony of Padua, preaching to the fishes, a magnificent vista of sea and sky. St. Francis, receiving the stigmata. St. Menas, brilliant in armor, and martyred. St. Catherine of Alexandria, mystically married to the infant Christ. St. Sebastian, flying the standard of faith and hope as he is led to martyrdom. St. Justina, facing martyrdom with double jeopardy, in the Uffizi and in her church at Padua. All these are pictures not to be compared with the best of Titian or Tintoretto, but still meriting the name of masterpieces. Perhaps finer than any of these is the family of Darius before Alexander, in London, with a somber queen and a lovely princess kneeling at the feet of the handsome and generous conqueror. As Paolo had begun his Venetian career with painting in the ducal palace, so he ended it with grand murals there, fit to thrill every patriotic Venetian soul. After the fires of 1574 and 1577, the decoration of the rebuilt interiors was assigned chiefly to Tintoretto and Veronese, and the theme was to be Venice herself, undaunted by fire or war, Turks or Portuguese. In the Sala del Collegio, or audience chamber, Paolo and his assistants painted on the carved and gilded ceiling 11 allegorical pictures of extraordinary elegance. Meekness with her lamb, Dialectics looking through a web of her own making, and Venice, a queen in ermine, with the Lion of St. Mark lying quietly at her feet and receiving honors from justice and peace. In a great oval in the ceiling of the Sala del Maggior Concilio, he painted the Triumph of Venice, picturing the incomparable city as a goddess enthroned among pagan deities, receiving a crown of glory from the sky. At her feet, the leading lords and ladies of the city and some tributary Moors, and below these, prancing warriors ready for her defense and pages holding hounds in leash. This was the zenith of Veronese. In 1586 he was chosen to replace Guariento's faded fresco, The Coronation of the Virgin, in that same hall of the Great Council. His sketch was made and approved, and he was preparing to paint the canvas when he was stricken with fever. Venice was shocked to learn in April 1588 that the still young painter of her glories was dead. The fathers at San Sebastiano begged for his remains, and Paolo was buried there, beneath the pictures by which he had made that church a home of his religious art. Time has reversed the judgment of his contemporaries and ranks him below his robust contemporary. Technically, he surpassed Tintoretto. In draftsmanship, composition, and color, he was the culmination of Venetian painting. His crowded pictures are not confused. His scenes and episodes are clear, his backgrounds bright. Tintoretto seems a prince of darkness beside this idolater of light. Veronese was also the greatest decorative painter of the Italian Renaissance, ever ready to conceive some delightful turn or surprise of color and form, like the man suddenly stepping out from behind a curtain half drawn across a classic portal in a fresco at the Villa Macere. This book is continued on Cassette 11, Side 1.